On January 17, 2026, President Donald Trump escalated public demands for United States control of Greenland and announced punitive tariffs on European countries if Denmark refused to sell the island. The announcement triggered immediate condemnation from Denmark, the European Union, and NATO partners. Protests erupted in Nuuk and Copenhagen. European leaders called the threats unacceptable. This isn't the first time the United States has tried to acquire Greenland. In 1946, the White House offered Denmark $100 million for the territory. Denmark refused. In 1867, the United States successfully purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. That transaction worked because Russia wanted to sell, and Alaska was sparsely populated with minimal political infrastructure. Greenland in 2026 is categorically different. The United States currently spends $3 to $4 billion over multi-year periods maintaining and upgrading strategic facilities in Greenland, primarily Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule. These facilities provide early warning radar, space tracking, and Arctic surveillance capabilities that are integral to continental defense. Greenland also sits on potentially massive deposits of rare earth elements and critical minerals, resources essential for high-tech manufacturing, renewable energy systems, and defense supply chains. Geological surveys suggest approximately 1.5 million tons of economically mineable rare earth reserves, enough to supply a meaningful percentage of certain elements if extraction and processing infrastructure were built. The strategic interest is real. The economic interest is real. But the path to securing those interests is not what the public rhetoric suggests. This is the money timeline. Today, we're examining why the United States wants deeper access to Greenland, why buying or annexing the territory is legally and politically impossible, and what realistic strategies exist for achieving American objectives without destroying alliances or violating international law. This is about understanding the difference between strategic goals and workable policy. The United States has three core strategic interests in Greenland: military geography, economic resources, and geopolitical competition. Each interest is legitimate and measurable. First, military and geographic positioning. Greenland's location gives it extraordinary strategic value for defense and surveillance. The island sits on polar air and missile trajectories between North America and Eurasia. Any intercontinental ballistic missile or hypersonic weapon traveling between these regions passes through or near Greenlandic airspace. Early warning radar systems positioned in Greenland provide critical minutes of advanced notice for missile defense. Pituffik Space Base, located in northwest Greenland, hosts radar and sensor systems that feed into United States missile warning networks and space situational awareness programs. These systems track satellites, debris, and potential threats in orbit. The base also serves as a logistics hub for Arctic operations. During the Cold War, the United States maintained a larger footprint in Greenland, including now abandoned installations. The modern posture is smaller but more technologically sophisticated. The Arctic is also becoming more operationally accessible as ice coverage declines. Shipping routes that were impassable for most of the year are now open seasonally. Military and commercial traffic in the Arctic is increasing. Control of or reliable access to Arctic staging points, airfields, and ports provides operational advantages for surveillance, search and rescue, and force projection. Greenland is the largest island in the Arctic and occupies a central position. Militarily, it matters. Second, economic resources and supply chain security. Recent geological surveys and private exploration have identified significant deposits of rare earth elements, nickel, copper, uranium, and other strategic minerals in Greenland. Rare earth elements are particularly important because they are essential inputs for electronics, renewable energy technologies like wind turbines and electric vehicle batteries, and advanced military systems. China currently dominates global rare earth supply chains. Approximately 60 to 70% of global rare earth production and over 85% of global rare earth processing capacity is controlled by China. This creates strategic dependency for Western countries. Diversifying supply sources is a clear policy objective for the United States and its allies. Greenland's retreating ice coverage and modern geological techniques have revealed mineral deposits that were previously unknown or inaccessible. The United States Geological Survey estimates approximately 1.5 million tons of economically recoverable rare earth reserves in Greenland. This is not the total geological potential, which is much larger, but the amount that could realistically be mined under current technology and market conditions. However, turning geological potential into actual supply is expensive and time-consuming. Greenland lacks infrastructure. There are no roads connecting most sites. Ports are limited. Power generation is minimal outside major settlements. The climate is harsh. Mining in the Arctic requires specialized equipment and extended timelines for construction and permitting. Environmental concerns are significant, and Greenlandic authorities require strict environmental reviews and local consultation before approving projects. Despite these challenges, the economic interest is real. Western governments and private investors see Greenland as part of a long-term strategy to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled supply chains. If infrastructure is built and projects are approved, Greenland could supply a meaningful percentage of certain rare earth elements within 10 to 15 years. That timeline requires sustained investment and political stability. Third, geopolitical competition in the Arctic. The United States is not the only major power interested in Greenland and the broader Arctic region. China and Russia are both expanding their presence and influence. Russia has a formal Arctic strategy that emphasizes military modernization, economic development, and expanded shipping along the Northern Sea route. Moscow has submitted legal claims under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to extend its continental shelf jurisdiction, invested heavily in Arctic-capable military hardware, and conducted symbolic actions like planting a flag on the Arctic seabed in 2007. Russia's approach combines legal claims, infrastructure investment, and military posture to secure Arctic influence. China, meanwhile, has adopted a patient, economically focused strategy. Beijing published an Arctic white paper in 2018 that describes China as a near Arctic state and promotes the concept of a polar Silk Road. China pursues Arctic access through research cooperation, investment in mineral exploration, port and logistics projects, and satellite and data infrastructure. Chinese companies have sought stakes in Greenlandic mining projects and infrastructure development. Western policymakers view these investments as potential sources of strategic leverage, creating dependencies that could be exploited during geopolitical conflicts. Neither China nor Russia has made formal territorial claims to Greenland. Their strategies focus on economic presence, scientific cooperation, and infrastructure control rather than sovereignty. But the cumulative effect of those strategies is to increase their influence and access while potentially limiting Western options. From the United States' perspective, allowing Chinese or Russian entities to control critical infrastructure in Greenland, own significant stakes in rare earth processing, or establish persistent logistical footholds creates long-term strategic risks. Countering that influence is a clear objective. The question is how to do so effectively and legally. These three interests, military geography, economic resources, and geopolitical competition, explain why Greenland matters to the United States. The interests are legitimate and based on measurable strategic considerations, but recognizing why Greenland matters does not mean the United States can acquire it. There are three fundamental constraints that make purchasing or annexing Greenland legally and politically impossible: Greenlandic self-determination, historical precedent showing that coercion fails, and alliance politics that impose costs on unilateral action. First, legal constraints and Greenlandic self-determination. Greenland is not an unoccupied territory or a colony that can be traded between governments. It is an autonomous country within the Kingdom of Denmark with explicit self-determination rights. In 2009, Greenland and Denmark agreed to the Self-Government Act, which recognizes Greenlanders as a people under international law with the right to self-determination. The Act grants Greenland control over most domestic matters, including natural resources, taxation, and policing. Denmark retains authority over foreign policy and defense, but decisions that affect Greenland require consultation with Nuuk, Greenland's capital. Any transfer of sovereignty would require consent from both the Danish government and the Greenlandic people. Polling and public statements since 2019 show overwhelming opposition among Greenlanders to any sale of their territory. Greenlandic politicians across the political spectrum have rejected the idea. The population is approximately 56,000 people, small by global standards, but politically organized and capable of asserting their rights. Attempting to transfer sovereignty without Greenlandic consent would violate international norms on self-determination and likely trigger legal challenges in international courts. It would also create a domestic political crisis in Denmark and Greenland, destabilizing the very region the United States seeks to secure. In short, Greenland cannot be bought unless Greenlanders agree to be bought. They do not agree. Second, historical precedent shows that attempts to acquire Greenland through pressure have consistently failed. The United States tried in 1946. Norway tried in 1931. Both failed for instructive reasons. After World War II, the United States explored purchasing Greenland from Denmark. Declassified documents show that in 1946, the White House and State Department discussed offering Denmark $100 million for the territory. The proposal was informal but serious. Denmark refused. Instead, the United States negotiated basing rights, which led to the 1951 Defense Agreement that still governs American military presence in Greenland today. The 1946 episode demonstrates two things. First, Denmark values sovereignty over Greenland and will not sell even when offered significant sums. Second, the United States was able to secure its core strategic objective, military basing, through negotiation rather than purchase. Earlier in 1931, Norway occupied a portion of eastern Greenland called Eirik Raudsland, claiming it as Norwegian territory. Denmark challenged the claim before the Permanent Court of International Justice, the predecessor to the International Court of Justice. In 1933, the court ruled overwhelmingly in Denmark's favor, affirming Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland and rejecting Norway's occupation. This case established that Greenland's sovereignty is settled under international law. Attempts to seize or claim portions of Greenland through unilateral action will not be recognized by international legal institutions. The precedent is clear and binding. History shows that great powers cannot simply take Greenland when they want it. Legal processes and diplomatic negotiations constrain unilateral action. The United States cannot ignore these constraints without undermining the international legal order it relies on in other contexts. Third, alliance politics impose severe costs on coercive strategies. Greenland is not a neutral or adversarial territory. It is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a founding member of NATO and a close American ally. The European Union also considers Denmark and Greenland part of the broader European security architecture. When the idea of buying Greenland was floated publicly in 2019 and again in January 2026, European reactions were swift and negative. Danish officials rejected any sale. Greenlandic leaders called the proposals disrespectful. European Union leaders condemned the rhetoric as coercive and damaging to transatlantic relations. NATO partners warned that using economic threats, such as tariffs, to pressure an ally into selling territory would undermine alliance cohesion. The United States depends on NATO for European security cooperation, intelligence sharing, and collective defense. It depends on the European Union for trade, regulatory coordination, and joint action on issues like sanctions against adversaries. Damaging these relationships for the sake of acquiring Greenland would impose strategic costs far greater than any benefit from ownership. Alliance management is not optional for the United States. It is central to American grand strategy. Coercive tactics that alienate allies reduce American influence and empower adversaries. China and Russia benefit when the United States is seen as unreliable or heavy-handed by its traditional partners. Moreover, coercion hardens opposition within Greenland itself. Greenlanders who might otherwise be open to deeper cooperation with the United States become defensive and resistant when their autonomy is threatened. Public pressure to sell the island reinforces the perception that the United States does not respect Greenlandic self-determination, making it harder to build the trust necessary for long-term partnerships. These three constraints, legal, historical, and political, make purchasing or annexing Greenland impossible as a practical policy. The United States cannot unilaterally override Greenlandic consent, cannot ignore international legal precedent, and cannot afford to alienate NATO and EU partners. Any strategy that ignores these constraints will fail. The good news is that history provides numerous examples of countries securing strategic access to bases, resources, and influence without owning territory. These models are cheaper, legally simpler, and diplomatically sustainable. The clearest example is Guantanamo Bay. The United States operates a naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba under a lease agreement dating to 1903. Cuba retains sovereignty. The United States retains indefinite use of the base. The arrangement has survived over a century, including decades of hostile relations between Washington and Havana. The base provides the United States with strategic access to the Caribbean without requiring ownership of Cuban territory. The model demonstrates that operational control and sovereignty can be separated. The United States gets what it needs militarily without the political complications of annexation. A similar arrangement exists with Diego Garcia in the Chagos Archipelago. The United Kingdom leased the island to the United States for military use. Diego Garcia hosts a major naval and air base that supports operations in the Indian Ocean and Middle East. The arrangement has been controversial due to the forced displacement of the Chagosian population, but from a strategic perspective, it shows how long-term leases can provide reliable access without transferring sovereignty. Recently, the UK negotiated to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius, while securing a 99-year lease for continued military use of Diego Garcia. This arrangement resolves the sovereignty dispute while preserving operational access. It is a model for how governments can adapt to changing political realities without losing strategic capabilities. The Panama Canal Zone provides another example. For most of the 20th century, the United States controlled the Panama Canal Zone under treaty arrangements that gave Washington administrative and military authority without full sovereignty over Panama. The arrangement ended in 1999 when the canal was transferred to Panamanian control, but for decades it allowed the United States to secure a vital strategic asset through negotiated agreements rather than annexation. These examples show that the United States has successfully pursued strategic objectives through leases, treaties, and negotiated arrangements many times. The current arrangement in Greenland follows the same model. The 1951 defense agreement between Denmark and the United States grants American forces the right to use facilities in Greenland, including Pituffik Space Base, without transferring sovereignty. The agreement has been updated and renewed over the decades and remains in effect. If the United States wants to expand its presence in Greenland, the logical path is to negotiate expanded basing rights, invest in dual-use infrastructure that benefits both military operations and Greenlandic communities, and offer economic incentives that make cooperation attractive to Nuuk and Copenhagen. Another instructive model is the Svalbard Treaty. Svalbard is an archipelago in the Arctic administered by Norway. The 1920 Svalbard Treaty recognized Norwegian sovereignty while granting all signatory states equal rights to economic activity, including fishing and mining, and prohibiting military installations. Norway enforces laws and provides administration, but other countries, including Russia, maintain commercial and research operations on the islands. The Svalbard model shows how sovereignty and economic access can be balanced through treaty arrangements. It is not a perfect analog to Greenland, but it demonstrates that international agreements can create frameworks for shared access to strategically valuable territories without requiring purchases or annexations. The broader lesson is that modern international relations offer flexible tools for securing strategic interests. Long-term leases, base access agreements, joint ventures, and multilateral treaties can provide the access and influence countries need without the legal and political costs of changing sovereignty. The United States has used these tools successfully in the past and can use them again in Greenland. Understanding what China and Russia are doing in the Arctic clarifies the nature of the competition and the most effective responses. Russia's Arctic strategy is comprehensive and state-directed. Moscow has published formal Arctic development plans that emphasize military presence, resource extraction, and shipping infrastructure along the Northern Sea route. The strategy combines legal claims under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to extend continental shelf jurisdiction, significant investments in Arctic-capable military hardware, including icebreakers and coastal defense systems, and civilian infrastructure projects that support both economic development and military logistics. Russia's approach is to assert presence through a combination of legal procedures, economic investments, and military modernization. The goal is to control Arctic shipping routes, extract resources from the Russian Arctic, and secure the northern border against potential threats. Russia does not claim Greenland or attempt to buy it. Instead, Russia builds its own Arctic capabilities and uses international law to extend its jurisdiction where possible. China's approach is different but equally deliberate. Beijing describes itself as a near-Arctic state, despite being geographically distant from the Arctic Circle. China's 2018 Arctic White Paper outlines a vision for a polar Silk Road that includes shipping, research cooperation, and resource development. China pursues this vision through scientific research programs, investments in Arctic mining projects, participation in Arctic governance forums, and infrastructure projects like ports and satellite ground stations. China's strategy is patient and economically focused. Chinese companies seek stakes in mining projects, offer financing for infrastructure development, and build research stations that provide long-term presence. The strategy avoids direct territorial claims but aims to create dependencies and influence through economic ties. Western policymakers worry that over time, Chinese investments could give Beijing leverage over critical supply chains and infrastructure decisions. Neither Russia nor China is trying to buy or annex Greenland. Their strategies recognize that sovereignty is settled and that attempting to challenge it would provoke unified Western opposition. Instead, they pursue influence through presence, investment, and legal maneuvering within existing international frameworks. This context is important because it shows that the competition for Arctic influence is not about ownership. It is about access, presence, and economic relationships. The United States does not need to own Greenland to counter Chinese and Russian strategies. It needs to offer better terms for cooperation, invest more effectively in Greenlandic development, and coordinate with allies to provide alternatives to Chinese financing and Russian energy. The competition is real, but the battlefield is not territorial annexation. It is economic partnership, infrastructure investment, and alliance coordination. Given the constraints and the competition, what should the United States actually do? There are 4 practical strategies that align with legal realities and political possibilities. First, expand and modernize basing arrangements through negotiation. The United States already invests heavily in Pituffik Space Base. Public reports indicate that the Air Force has committed nearly $4 billion over roughly a decade to upgrade and maintain the facility. A 2024 contract awarded to Serco, worth approximately $320 million over 4 years, focuses on modernizing the base's backup power systems. These investments are substantial and reflect the strategic importance of the facility. The United States should continue and expand these investments while negotiating with Denmark and Greenland to clarify long-term access, update the 1951 Defense Agreement to reflect modern operational needs, and coordinate on additional dual-use infrastructure like ports, airfields, and communications networks that benefit both military operations and civilian economic development. Greenland benefits from improved infrastructure. The United States benefits from reliable access. This is a natural basis for negotiation. Second, support responsible mineral development through joint ventures and financing. The United States cannot mine Greenlandic rare earth deposits unilaterally, but it can participate in projects that respect Greenlandic sovereignty and environmental standards. Private companies, including Cobalt Metals, backed by prominent American investors, have already secured exploration licenses and begun financing projects. The United States government can support these efforts through export credit financing, development assistance for processing infrastructure, and research and development partnerships that help Greenland build the technical capacity to extract and process minerals sustainably. Critically, any mineral development must secure Greenlandic consent, provide local economic benefits, and meet strict environmental standards. Projects that ignore local concerns will fail politically and legally. The United States should position itself as a partner that respects these requirements, contrasting with models where foreign investors seek to extract resources with minimal local benefit. Third, build allied consortia to compete with a Chinese investment. One reason Chinese companies have made inroads in Arctic projects is that they offer financing and technical support that Western competitors have been slow to match. The United States, European Union, and Nordic countries should coordinate to create investment vehicles that provide competitive terms for Greenlandic infrastructure and mining projects. This could take the form of multilateral funds, joint ventures between allied companies, or coordinated development assistance programs. The goal is to offer Greenland alternatives to Chinese financing that come with transparent terms, respect for local governance, and alignment with Western environmental and labor standards. Fourth, strengthen NATO and multilateral Arctic cooperation. The Arctic Council and other multilateral forums provide venues for coordination on issues like search and rescue, environmental protection, and scientific research. The United States should use these forums to build consensus with allies on Arctic priorities and to isolate adversarial behavior. NATO's Arctic focus has increased since the early 2020s, with expanded exercises and coordination on security issues. Strengthening these efforts provides a collective framework for managing Arctic competition without requiring individual countries to act alone. Together, these strategies provide a realistic playbook. Negotiate expanded basing, support joint mineral ventures, build allied investment consortia, and strengthen multilateral cooperation. None of these require purchasing Greenland. All of them are achievable through diplomacy and investment. Public demands to buy or annex Greenland, especially when accompanied by threats like tariffs, actively undermine American strategic objectives. First, the rhetoric hardens Greenlandic opposition. Greenlanders respond to perceived threats to their autonomy by becoming more defensive and less willing to cooperate. Polling shows strong opposition to any sale. Public pressure from Washington reinforces the perception that the United States does not respect Greenlandic self-determination, making it harder to build the trust necessary for long-term partnerships. Second, the rhetoric damages alliances. Denmark and other European allies interpret coercive tactics as hostile. European leaders have publicly condemned the approach and warned that it harms transatlantic relations. NATO cohesion depends on mutual respect and trust. Threatening allies with economic punishment to force territorial concessions erodes that trust. Third, the rhetoric provides ammunition to adversaries. China and Russia can point to American coercion as evidence that Washington is unreliable and self-interested. This makes it easier for Beijing and Moscow to position themselves as more respectful partners, even when their actual practices are exploitative. Fourth, the rhetoric distracts from practical policy. While public attention focuses on the spectacle of buying Greenland, the hard work of negotiating basing agreements, financing mineral projects, and coordinating with allies receives less attention and fewer resources. Effective policy requires sustained diplomatic effort, not headlines. The Alaska Purchase in 1867 succeeded because Russia wanted to sell and the conditions were right. Greenland in 2026 is not analogous. Greenlanders do not want to be sold. Denmark will not sell. Coercion will not change these facts. The United States can achieve its strategic objectives through negotiation, investment, and multilateral cooperation. Rhetoric that ignores these realities is not just ineffective. It is actively harmful. The United States has legitimate strategic interests in Greenland. Military geography matters. Rare earth supply chains matter. Countering Chinese and Russian influence matters. These are real issues that require serious policy responses. But serious policy requires understanding constraints. Greenland cannot be purchased because Greenlanders have self-determination rights and will not consent. Historical attempts to acquire or claim Greenland through pressure have failed. Alliance politics impose costs on coercive strategies that outweigh any benefit from ownership. The United States already spends billions maintaining strategic facilities in Greenland. It already has basing rights under treaty. It already has pathways to participate in mineral development. The tools exist to achieve American objectives without changing sovereignty. History shows that countries regularly secure strategic access through leases, treaties, and joint ventures. Guantanamo, Diego Garcia, the Panama Canal, and the current Pituffik arrangement all demonstrate that operational control does not require ownership. The Svalbard Treaty shows how sovereignty and shared economic access can coexist. China and Russia are not trying to buy Greenland. They are pursuing influence through investment, research, and legal claims. The United States can counter these strategies by offering better partnerships, investing more effectively, and coordinating with allies. The competition is about access and influence, not territory. The Realistic Playbook is clear. Negotiate expanded basing, support responsible mineral development, build allied investment consortia, and strengthen multilateral Arctic cooperation. These strategies respect Greenlandic autonomy, preserve alliances, and achieve American objectives. Public rhetoric about buying Greenland actively undermines these strategies. It hardens opposition, damages alliances, empowers adversaries, and distracts from practical policy. Strategy requires discipline. Effective policy requires respecting legal and political realities. The United States can secure its interests in Greenland, but it must choose strategy over spectacle, negotiation over coercion, and partnership over ownership. That is the path to sustainable success. Thanks for watching The Money Timeline.